Imagine a dark stone prison cell in the heart of ancient Athens. The year is 399 BC. The sun is setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the floor. In the center of the room sits an ugly, barefoot 70-year-old man. He is surrounded by his weeping, devastated friends and students. A prison guard walks in, his hands shaking, holding a wooden cup filled with a foul-smelling dark liquid. It is hemlock, a deadly neurotoxin that will paralyze his respiratory system and slowly suffocate him to death. His friends beg him to escape. They have bribed the guards. They have a ship waiting in the harbor. All he has to do is stand up and walk out the door. But the old man smiles, gently takes the cup and drinks it down to the last drop, as calmly as if it were a glass of sweet wine. This is the death of Socrates. It is arguably the most famous execution in human history, second only to Jesus Christ. For 2,400 years, we have been told that this was the ultimate act of intellectual heroism. We are told that Socrates died for the truth, that he was a noble martyr who refused to compromise his values in a corrupt society. But on Deconstructing Minds, we don't blindly accept the myths written by grieving disciples. We perform psychological autopsies. And when you put the death of Socrates under a psychological microscope, the noble martyrdom begins to look terrifyingly like something else. What if Socrates didn't have to die? What if his trial wasn't a miscarriage of justice, but a meticulously orchestrated psychological manipulation? What if the father of Western reason used the Athenian legal system to commit the ancient equivalent of suicide by cop? Today, we are deconstructing the patient zero of philosophy. We are going to look behind the marble bust to find a man who abandoned his starving family, humiliated his neighbors for sport, and claimed to take his orders from an invisible voice in his head. Brace yourselves. We are about to put the mind of Socrates on trial, and the verdict might destroy everything you thought you knew about the birth of human logic. To understand the bizarre behavior of Socrates, we must first confront the most glaring, yet historically ignored, symptom of his psychology. The man who is universally credited with inventing rational, logical thought did not actually trust human logic. He trusted a ghost. Throughout his entire life, Socrates openly admitted that he heard a voice inside his head. He called it his daimonion, a divine sign. According to Socrates, this voice had been speaking to him since childhood. It would suddenly interrupt him in the middle of the street, during conversations, or right before he made a decision. The voice never told him what to do, it only told him what not to do. It was a purely prohibitive auditory hallucination. When the voice spoke, Socrates would freeze, sometimes standing entirely motionless in a public square for hours, completely unresponsive to the outside world, listening to the void. How does modern psychology view a man who freezes in public, hears voices, and believes he is a vessel for divine communication? Today, a psychiatrist would likely explore a diagnosis of schizotypal personality disorder, or experiencing auditory hallucinations linked to a dissociative state. But in ancient Athens, this neurological glitch became his ultimate psychological weapon. Think about the sheer manipulative power of the demon. In any argument, Socrates could deploy an unbeatable, thought-terminating cliché. If someone cornered him with a good point, or if he wanted to avoid a social responsibility, he didn't have to provide a logical counter-argument. He could simply say, "My divine voice forbids me from doing this." You cannot argue with a man's personal hallucination. Psychologically, the demon served as an externalized locus of control. Socrates was a man who deeply feared making the wrong choice or being tied down by the mundane obligations of normal life. By projecting his own subconscious hesitation onto an external, divine voice, he absolved himself of all personal responsibility. He didn't abandon his political duties or his family because he was lazy. He did it because God told him to. He managed to convince the wealthiest, smartest young men in Athens, including Plato, that his auditory hallucinations were proof of his wholly, untouchable genius. The entire foundation of Western philosophy wasn't built purely on rational deduction. It was built by a man who used a voice in his head as an absolute moral authority, effectively turning his own psychological anomaly into a cult of personality. If you read the ancient histories, you will quickly encounter the name Xanthippe. She was Socrates' wife, and for 2 millennia, male historians have painted her as the ultimate villain of antiquity, a nagging, hysterical shrew who constantly screamed at her brilliant, saintly husband. The most famous anecdote tells of a day when Xanthippe, enraged by Socrates' philosophical detachment, dumped a chamber pot full of urine and feces over his head in the middle of the street. Socrates supposedly wiped his face and calmly replied, "After the thunder comes the rain." Philosophers use this story to praise his stoic patience. But on Deconstructing Minds, we have to look at the psychology of the woman holding the chamber pot. Let's reframe the reality. Socrates was a man who deliberately refused to work. He claimed that working for money would compromise his intellectual freedom. Consequently, he plunged his family into absolute, grinding poverty. Xanthippe was raising 3 young sons in a patriarchal society where a woman could not legally own property or get a job to support herself. She was entirely dependent on a husband who spent his days wandering the marketplace barefoot, chatting with the billionaire teenagers of Athens, while his own children went hungry. When we look at this through a modern clinical lens, Socrates' behavior wasn't noble asceticism, it was severe financial and emotional neglect. He engaged in a classic tactic of weaponized incompetence. By refusing to participate in the real world, he forced Xanthippe to carry the crushing burden of their survival, and then he used her resulting stress and anger to make himself look like a patient martyr. Xanthippe wasn't a crazy shrew. She was a desperate, terrified mother pushed to the absolute edge of a nervous breakdown by a husband suffering from covert narcissism. Socrates didn't love poverty because he was holy. He loved poverty because it gave him a permanent moral high ground. It allowed him to look down on the working men of Athens. He sacrificed his wife's sanity and his children's well-being on the altar of his own massive, untouchable ego. He needed a screaming wife to prove to his wealthy students just how unbothered and superior he truly was. If you go to a modern law school, you will be taught the Socratic method. It is presented as a noble, collaborative search for truth, where a teacher asks probing questions to help a student discover the right answer. But if we observe how Socrates actually used this method on the streets of ancient Athens, it begins to look less like a classroom and more like a public execution. Socrates called himself the gadfly of Athens, a biting insect sent by the gods to wake up a lazy horse. But the reality is that Socrates was the ancient world's greatest intellectual troll. Here is how his psychological trap worked. Socrates would approach a powerful politician, a famous general, or a respected poet in the middle of the crowded agora. He would deploy Socratic irony, acting like a confused, humble, and ignorant old man. He would say, "Oh, great general, I know nothing of courage. Please teach me what courage is." The victim's ego would swell. They would give a pompous answer, and then the trap snapped shut. Socrates would begin a relentless, rapid-fire barrage of hyperlogical questions. He would twist their words, expose their contradictions, and slowly back them into a psychological corner until they were forced to admit in front of a laughing crowd that they had no idea what they were talking about. This wasn't education, this was intellectual sadism. Socrates got a massive hit of narcissistic supply from publicly dismantling the egos of powerful men.
And who was watching this? His followers. A gang of rich, arrogant, anti-democratic teenagers, including Plato and Alcibiades. These young aristocrats followed Socrates around the city like a modern-day YouTube prank squad, howling with laughter as the old man humiliated the democratic leaders of their city. Socrates wasn't searching for the truth. He never provided any answers of his own. His only goal was deconstruction, tearing down the psychological defenses of others to prove his own superiority. In modern terms, he was engaging in targeted social sabotage. He systematically destroyed the reputations of the men holding the city together. Is it any wonder that the city of Athens eventually decided that this gadfly had to be crushed? In 399 BC, the city of Athens finally snapped. Socrates was arrested and put on trial for 2 charges: refusing to recognize the gods of the state and corrupting the youth. He was judged by a jury of 500 ordinary Athenian citizens. For centuries, historians have portrayed this trial as a tragic miscarriage of justice, a mob of ignorant peasants murdering a saint. But when we analyze the transcripts of the trial, written by his devout student, Plato, a completely different psychological picture emerges. Socrates didn't just lose his trial. He deliberately, meticulously engineered his own execution. In modern criminology, there is a term for this: suicide by cop. It occurs when an individual deliberately behaves in a threatening or provocative manner to provoke a lethal response from law enforcement. Socrates performed the intellectual version of this. During the trial, he didn't apologize. He didn't defend himself against the specific charges. Instead, he used his time on the stand to insult the jury, mock their intelligence, and lecture them on their own moral inferiority. Despite this breathtaking arrogance, the jury only found him guilty by a very narrow margin. Athens didn't actually want to kill him. They just wanted him to shut up and go away. Then came the penalty phase. Under Athenian law, the prosecution proposed a penalty, death, and the defendant was allowed to propose a counter-penalty. If Socrates had suggested a reasonable fine, or simply offered to go into exile, the jury almost certainly would have accepted it. He would have lived. But what did Socrates propose? He looked at the 500 men who had just convicted him and suggested that his punishment should be free meals in the Prytaneum for the rest of his life, an honor reserved only for Olympic champions and military heroes. It was the ultimate slap in the face. It was an act of pathological defiance. He was telling them, "I am a living god, and you are lucky to have me." Enraged by this unbelievable display of narcissistic grandiosity, the jury voted overwhelmingly to execute him. More people voted to kill him than had voted him guilty in the first place. He literally talked them into murdering him. Why? Because Socrates was a 70-year-old man. He knew his physical health was about to decline. He knew that fading away quietly in a foreign city as a forgotten exile was a pathetic end. But dying by hemlock, surrounded by his weeping disciples, murdered by a corrupt state, that was immortality. His martyr complex was complete. He used the legal system of Athens to perform a theatrical suicide, ensuring that his name would outlive the very city that condemned him. Socrates died exactly as he lived, in total control of the narrative, emotionally detached from the people who loved him and obsessed with his own legacy. As the hemlock paralyzed his body, his last words were to remind his friend Crito to sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing. He was implying that death was a cure for the disease of living in the physical world. On Deconstructing Minds, our autopsy of Socrates leaves us with a brilliant but deeply disturbing figure. The father of Western philosophy was a man who created the prototype for the toxic intellectual. He taught us to value abstract logic, but he used it as a weapon for intellectual sadism. He claimed to be searching for virtue, but he engaged in severe emotional neglect of his own wife and children.
He worshipped reason, but based his entire life on auditory hallucinations from a daemon. Socrates infected the Western world with a very dangerous psychological virus. The idea that the mind is sacred and the body and all its physical relationships, families, and emotional needs is just a distraction. He created the myth of the tortured, misunderstood genius who is too smart for normal human empathy. We don't deconstruct Socrates to erase him from history. His contributions to human logic are undeniable. But we deconstruct him to remind ourselves that brilliance is not the same as goodness. You can be the smartest man in the room, the inventor of a new way of thinking, and still be an absolutely terrible human being to the people who depend on you. Socrates drank the hemlock to become a god. But today, we pour out the cup to see the deeply flawed, manipulative, and arrogant man who was hiding at the bottom.